Hey, very good. Well, let's kick right off. So, many people tuned in, and thank you for that, to our rebroadcast, simulcast, if you will, of RSBN's coverage of the president's presser um, regarding on Monday regarding the findings on autism and potentially some of the causes, and actually some of the potential treatment that might be applied to this. And so right away, it was very interesting. He was very notably focused on one particular finding, and that was that there seems to be a correlation. We're going to talk about this more deeply in a moment. A correlation between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and the incidence of autism in the offspring. Acetaminophen goes by several different brand names, one of which is Tylenol. And the president seemed to really, really focus on don't use Tylenol through much of the presser. Why he focused that way, we're not quite certain, but it was very interesting. And many people pushed back, like they did here. Oh gosh, he couldn't even say the chemical name of it. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and so forth. Well, as is always the case, we recommend people do their homework and check this stuff out. Go for the facts themselves. And so we did that. We went out and we're going to come back to the press conference itself in just a moment, but I wanted to immediately go to this notion of people saying, well, there's no finding that says there's any correlation between acetaminophen and autism. Well, here's what we found. We went to Grok, and you could go to other AI engines, but we went to Grok and we said, what is the finding, if any, on autism and the incidence of autism, along with the use of Tylenol or another brand of acetaminophen during pregnancy? And it was very interesting. It said the most comprehensive recent review published in 2025 identified 46 primary studies worldwide investigating this link, including associations with ASD, which is the autism spectrum disorder. It's a range of different disorders that are all deemed underneath the autism spectrum, if you will, and other neurodevelopmental disorders. Of those, 27 studies reported a significant positive correlation with autism spectrum disorder or related outcomes. 9 showed no significant association, and 4 indicated positive effects. And then they also go on to say that higher quality studies, those with better control groups, were more likely to find a correlation. Now, understand that a correlation means an overlap, if you will. It does not prove things like causation. So does this definitively prove that Tylenol or another brand of acetaminophen causes ASD? No, it doesn't. These studies don't show that. But the very fact that there's an overlap would be cause for concern in many parents, and so they deserve to know this. What struck me as interesting was they brought this out, and these studies have been around, many of them, for quite some time. And so one of the questions was, why would they bring these out now as if this was massively brand new findings? And I'll give you a couple examples. Here's a list of those, and they go all the way back, believe it or not, to 2014. And they come up, you can look at the various dates involved. And then for folks that say, well, there's really no evidence of any overlap here. Well, Mount Sinai actually supports supports evidence that prenatal acetaminophen may be linked to increased risk of autism. Again, are we proving causality? No. But what struck me was the timing. And so one question is, what else was said during this presser? And was what else was said equally important? Perhaps. Well, let's take a look. As the presser went on, the president called on, I think, 6 other speakers and then 2 moms who had children with autism. But he brought up a couple subjects that I think had meaning, but that didn't they didn't specifically relate to the topic of the presser. Listen to this.
The Amish, yeah, virtually. I heard none. See, Bobby wants to be very careful with what he says, and he should, but I'm not so careful with what I say. But you have certain groups. The Amish, as an example, they have essentially no autism. First, effective immediately, the FDA will be notifying physicians that the use of well, let's see how we say that. Acetaminophen. Is that okay? Which is basically commonly known as Tylenol, during pregnancy, can be associated with a very increased risk of autism. So taking Tylenol is not good.
And he repeated that a number of times through the remainder of the presser. So, but what was interesting was that he brought up the Amish. Now, what do the Amish typically do in terms of medical preparations? They often have some of their own and often avoid some of the things that the greater populace might take advantage of. That doesn't mean they, for example, never get vaccines, but a substantial portion of them have a tendency not to. And so the president making a comment about the Amish having almost no, or perhaps he said no incidence of autism, I think is almost a hint. It's almost a signal that something's there that we need to pay attention to. In addition, later on in the presser, RFK actually did talk about vaccines, and let's hear what he had to say.
Continuing to investigate a multiplicity of potential causes with no areas of taboo. One area that we are closely examining, as the president mentioned, is vaccines. Some 40 to 70% of mothers who have children with autism believe that their child was injured by a vaccine. President Trump believes that we should be listening to these mothers instead of gaslighting and marginalizing them like prior administrations. Some of our friends like to say that we should believe all women. But some of these same people have been silencing and demonizing these mothers for 3 decades because research on the potential link between autism and vaccines has been actively suppressed in the past. It will take time for an honest look at this topic by scientists.
Okay, so listen carefully to what he said. He began by saying that they'd been looking at this for some time and continue to look at it. He talked about parents and mothers' opinions about vaccines and the potential that they may have harmed their children. But he also concluded or continued with his comment saying that it would take time to study this. So they really presented on his own no conclusions there. That I found very interesting. So they continued to look at this, but where many had assumed that this would be all about findings with regard to the vaccines, it in turn really was not. It was about findings with regard to acetaminophen, potentially, and its correlation to ASD.
You know, Bill, I have an antidote to that because I usually don't answer phone surveys, but I got one today, and the CDC came up, and I said, okay, I'll because I don't answer calls if I don't know who they're from or whatever, like cold calls. But so I answered it, and it was a survey, in-depth survey, about 15 minutes on my attitude toward vaccines. And I found that bizarre and a little bit worrisome because why is the CDC checking up on the public's reaction to Trump's announcement?
How did you get on the list?
And yeah, exactly. So I found that quite interesting and a little disturbing.
I did, and it is very interesting. Let's go back here for just a minute. I want to show something else. So the key question is, what else was said and what did it mean? So those are the two scenes we just showed. Here's, again, we've shown this in the past. This is a picture of the incidence of autism in a series of years going all the way back to about 1970. And in 1970, the incidence was about 1 in 10,000. And currently, this chart stops, I believe, in 2022. We are being told that right now it's about 1 in 30. And in, I believe, California and young males, it's 1 in 12, I believe.
Yes.
So one of the questions is, well, is this simply, because this came up a lot in posts over the last 24 hours as well, is this simply we've expanded the definition of it, so we're finding more of them? Well, RFK in the presser pointed out that if that were true, and this study goes all the way back to it was actually occurring back in the 70s, however, at a much lower rate. If it were occurring as much as it is now, we would expect to see people in their 50s, perhaps 60s, that went back to living in the 70s and 80s that have autism and grew up with it and live with it now. But we don't. As a matter of fact, RFK pointed out that he knew of very few, if any, people of his age, he's a little bit older than I am, that have symptoms of autism. And so that would suggest that this is not just a definition of autism and spotting it more because we've broadened the definition. It's about that it is actually occurring more prevalently. One of the reasons, and I found it very interesting, I did a similar search on Grok looking for any studies that indicated a correlation between vaccine administration and autism. And it's very interesting. The answer was an almost unequivocal no. Had no studies with, and those that had showed no correlation at all. Yet even common sense suggests something to look at, and that is this. If we go back to 1962, for example, the average total number of doses of vaccine given to a child would be 5. In 83, it was 24. So approximately 5 times as many. And then in 2018, it was 72.
And people are much sicker and fatter and unhealthy.
Well, let's go back to the previous chart. Look at the growth. So back in the 60s, 70s, 5. Then we get into the 80s, and we get into 24. Then we get into 2018. We're up here, further up the scale, and we're dealing with 12 times as many vaccine doses being administered. And we see this growth. Again, is that scientific? No, it's not, but it's almost just common sense. So it is very fascinating to find that there are no studies that provide any correlation between vaccine administration and autism, yet simple review of the data would suggest that there might be something there to concentrate more on.
Should be looked at, yeah.
So we will talk more about that, I'm sure, in the coming days. I know that we are due to speak with the head of Children's Health Defense, an organization founded by Robert F. Kennedy, and one that has looked into the notion of all types of environmental and chemical and medical factors that could affect children's health, and has done so for a number of years. So I think we'll have some interesting feedback following that conversation later in this week.
Yeah, Mary Holland will be there, and we're looking forward to speaking with her. She's a friend of the show, and it looks like we're going to be sponsoring a Children's Health Defense Conference in Austin, Texas in November to further that relationship with CHD. So
that's great. That's great. Okay, why don't we take a